Okay. Um, So my colleague, Congressman Hultgren, is on the floor right now. It's a little bit delayed, so he'll be here shortly, but we're going to kick the hearing off and begin because we're going to have votes a little, not too long, so I want to be respectful of everybody's time here. So good afternoon. I want to welcome our witnesses and to those of you in the audience to the excuse me, Commission's hearing on human rights and denuclearization in North Korea. You know, these days there are not many issues that inspire near universal agreement in the international community, but recognition of the horrendous human rights situation in North Korea is one of them. In 2013, the UN Human Rights Council established a commission of inquiry to investigate the systematic, widespread, and grave violations of human rights in the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, with a view to ensuring full accountability. The Commission's final report found that the North Korean regime had committed crimes against humanity and called for a UN Security Council referral to the International Criminal Court. In 2014, the UN General Assembly approved a resolution echoing that call with an overwhelming vote. In March 2017, the UN Human Rights Council resolved to establish a repository to archive evidence detailing the country's human rights violations. These uncommon UN actions reflect the severity of the abuses in North Korea, which include a total denial of civil, political, and religious liberties, mass imprisonment with severe physical abuse, torture and executions, food shortages leading to starvation and lack of access to medical care, and lack of freedom of movement. Essentially, every single right that should be guaranteed is not. Meanwhile, North Korea has active nuclear weapons and ballistic missile programs, and is also believed to have chemical and biological weapons capacity. On the nuclear front, North Korea is unconstrained by international agreements. It unilaterally withdrew from the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons in 2013. It is not a party to the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, and has conducted 6 increasingly sophisticated nuclear tests since 2006. I think it's fair to say that Kim Jong-un makes most of us very, very nervous. And for that reason alone, most people welcome the de-escalation of tension between the U.S. and North Korea that accompanied President Trump's summit with the North Korean leader last June. But it is also clear that the summit marked the beginning of a process, not the end. No agreement is in place, and negotiations seem to be ongoing. So it is a good moment to ask how the human rights situation interacts with the nuclear problem and whether the two can or should be addressed simultaneously. I strongly support denuclearization, not just in North Korea, but throughout the world. Ridding the world of the threat of nuclear destruction would be one of the greatest gifts we could give to our children and generations to come. I also believe that the way to achieve that goal is through direct, strong, persistent, multilateral diplomatic engagement. I have not taken the position that human rights must be part of the nuclear negotiations, and I would not want a failure to improve human rights to preclude a nuclear deal. But although we know that Kim Jong-un believes nuclear weapons are necessary to secure his regime's existence, the risks to the regime are not only, or perhaps even mainly, external. In the long run, I expect the biggest and most important threats are internal. The Commission of Inquiry described the human rights violations in North Korea as mere excesses of the state. They describe them not as mere excesses of the state, but as essential components of a political system that seeks to dominate every aspect of its citizens' lives and terrorizes them from within. Certainly, fear can be deployed to sustain a barbarous regime for a while, but not forever. And as Western media and others begin to have at least some limited access to the country, we are also seeing how decades of near isolation have consolidated the state's hold over how its citizens think, believe, and interpret the outside world. Perhaps we need to rethink the role human rights could play in denuclearization talks. Instead of dropping discussion of human rights once the regime comes to the table, maybe we should approach measures to improve human rights as strategic steps to ease internal sources of pressure and instability, as well as ways to increase the confidence of the international community. The reunification and communication between family members living in North and the South are other ways tensions might ease, not just in the political sphere, but in the human rights landscape as well. A nuclear North Korea is not in anyone's interest, but neither is a North Korea that collapses due to internal unrest. Our witnesses will be discussing ideas along these lines today, and I look forward to hearing their views and their recommendations. Our panel includes Greg Scarlato. I want to make sure I get pronounced these from Massachusetts, so sometimes we don't pronounce anything very well. He's the executive director of the Committee for Human Rights in North Korea. And prior to that, he was with the Korea Economic Institute. We welcome him here. Victor Cha is a professor of government at Georgetown University, a senior advisor and Korea chair at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and a fellow in human rights at the George W. Bush Institute. He served as the deputy head of delegation for the United States at the six-party talks during the Bush administration, and we see you on TV all the time, too, so it's great to have you here. Roberta Cohen has served as senior advisor to the representative of the UN Secretary General on Internally Displaced Persons, Deputy Assistant Secretary in the State Department's First Human Rights Bureau, and Senior Advisor to the U.S. Delegation to the UN General Assembly and Commission on Human Rights. Currently, she's the co-chair emeritus of the Committee for Human Rights in North Korea. So I want to welcome you all here. We look forward to your testimony, and your complete statements will be made part of the record, so you can read them or you can summarize them, whatever you want to do. And we will begin with you. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. It is on, sir, yes. So, Congressman McGovern, I wish to begin by thanking you for inviting me, thanking you and Congressman Holmgren for inviting me to testify before you today in diplomatic interaction with North Korea. For over a quarter century, human rights have been separated from and outcompeted by denuclearization talks. The track record indicates that North Korea's diplomatic credibility is low. Improving North Korea's human rights record could be the litmus test of North Korea's credibility to engage on other issues. After all, if a government has no regard for the lives of its own people, what regard does it have for the lives of others? What deters it from provoking a war or proliferating missile technology and weapons of mass destruction to terrorists? In the case of North Korea, human rights can be an indicator of good faith and add clear and achievable benchmarks that increase credibility as part of a larger agreement. For instance, although North Korea released 3 American detainees earlier this year, it still holds an estimated 80 to 120,000 political prisoners inside its gulags, whose existence it denies. North Korea could confirm the locations of its prison camps and grant access to the International Committee of the Red Cross and UN agencies to provide humanitarian assistance to North Korea's most vulnerable, which should include prisoners. In addition to addressing the camps, the regime could allow more access to outside information, thus signaling willingness to respect fundamental human rights. The North Korean Criminal Code could be revised to no longer prohibit listening to allegedly hostile broadcasting. The regime could decouple or slow relations with regimes hostile to the United States, regimes also engaged in severe human rights abuses and international terrorism, such as Syria and Iran. This would signal that the Kim regime is more focused on its relationship with the United States and perhaps on its own people rather than economic and trade activities with fellow perpetrators. While these are merely suggestions, the responses by the Kim regime could be gauged and therefore serve as indicators or even benchmarks to assess the credibility of North Korea's commitment to any larger agreement with the United States. Several key human rights issues could be included in larger discussions with North Korea. Such issues should include political imprisonment, loyalty-based social discrimination, modern-day slavery, human trafficking, and the reunification of separated families. The most pressing human rights concern is North Korea's system of political imprisonment, where crimes against humanity are being committed. Most of North Korea's human rights violations stem from its Songbun system, which is North Korea's loyalty-based discriminatory social classification system. Any promise of change or abolishment of the Songbun system would be a significant step toward improving the lives of millions of North Koreans. A 2018 Global Slavery Index study found that North Korea has an estimated 2,640,000 people living in modern slavery, making North Korea the country with the highest prevalence of modern-day slavery in the world. North Korea officially dispatches about 100,000 workers to over 30 countries in Asia, Africa, Europe, and the Middle East. The Kim family regime confiscates much of the $200 million earned by these workers annually. Despite North Korea being a party to the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, children are also exploited to generate the resources needed to maintain the regime in power. They're forced to participate in mass games and public mobilization campaigns and perform forced labor ranging from road cleaning to railway construction. Many women and children fleeing North Korea are trafficked in China. If apprehended, they face forcible repatriation and subsequent punishment. Reunions of separated families, including 100,000 Korean Americans with relatives in North Korea, would be possible only if North Korea allowed continuous, sustainable, unsupervised family reunions, or if it allowed its citizens to travel to third countries for such reunions. Two examples where human rights have been a part of U.S. foreign policy in the past may provide a worthy precedent. They were part of multilateral and bilateral talks with the Soviet Union. The Helsinki Accords were a multilateral approach to political, economic, and human rights issues in Europe, as well as to collective security. If a similar model were applied to North Korea, the intent here would be setting up a vehicle for discussion about a range of subjects, including human rights, rather than limiting talks with North Korea to denuclearization. Certainly, the downside of a Helsinki process-type approach to North Korea is that North Korea could exploit and abuse diplomatic interaction to pay only lip service to its human rights obligations while gaining recognition as a nuclear power. Under such circumstances, failure to comply with human rights obligations would, again, provide a litmus test of North Korea's commitment to resolving security issues. In addition to a multilateral setting, the United States has put forward human rights issues bilaterally while negotiating nuclear agreements with the Soviet Union. Both the Carter and the Reagan administrations rejected and disproved the argument that raising human rights concerns could risk good U.S.-Soviet relations and arms control. President Ronald Reagan and Secretary of State George Shultz relentlessly pressed Soviet leaders on the issue of Soviet Jewry and made the issue a priority until Soviet Jews were allowed to emigrate freely. To President Reagan and Secretary Shultz, the Soviets addressing this human rights issue was indication that they were ready for arms talks. As diplomatic interaction with North Korea continues, perhaps the Reagan-Shultz approach to human rights in the Soviet Union could provide a relevant precedent and serve as the litmus test of North Korean commitment to a negotiated settlement of security issues. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Mr. Cha, welcome.
Thank you, Chairman. It's a pleasure to be here and a distinct honor to be on this particular committee because I remember 14 years ago, briefing Congressman Lantos in his office before his first trip, he and Bob King before their first trip to North Korea. So it's a real pleasure to be here with you. What is both amazing and depressing about the diplomacy following the Singapore summit meeting between President Trump and the North Korean leader are the constants that have reemerged following a period of arguably the most dramatic change we have witnessed on the peninsula in decades. First, despite the Panmunjom and Singapore summit declarations about a nuclear-free Korean peninsula, North Korea still pursues its strategy of Byungjin, the pursuit of nuclear weapons and economic development. Second, despite President Trump's decision to meet the North Korean leader and seek some sort of reconciliation, the United States still pursues complete, verifiable, and irreversible dismantlement of all nuclear weapons, missiles, and WMD programs from the country. The third constant in the diplomacy that has not changed is the problem of sequencing. Basically, the issue here is there's an impasse in the negotiations, and anyone who's familiar with this knows that this impasse is not something we have not seen in the past. North Korea wants a peace treaty, peace agreement, and the lifting of sanctions first, and the United States wants a commitment to denuclearization, particularly in the form of a declaration, verification, and a timeline for dismantlement. We want that first. So, in short, each side wants the other to go first. And that is not something new. It's something we've seen in the past. But in this case, it's despite the two leaders meeting. The fourth constant relates to human rights. And here I think you're not going to find much disagreement, I think, in this group. But as in the past, the summit meetings, the negotiations have privileged the nuclear negotiations above all else, including the human rights abuses inside the country, despite the UN resolutions that you mentioned, Chairman, as well as the UN Commission of Inquiry report that condemn the regime for all of its human rights abuses. The tendency that has emerged in past administrations' negotiations with North Korea is the same one that is emerging today. When there is no diplomacy and when there is no diplomacy on denuclearization taking place with North Korea, we amp up the volume on human rights, support defector testimonies castigating the regime, and support efforts to get outside information into the country. But once the negotiations begin, the human rights issues become too uncomfortable and too inconvenient to talk about. Negotiators do not want to raise them for fear that it will create a distraction from the main issue, which is denuclearization, or even worse, that it might offend the regime and submarine the negotiations. Yet, I think, and all of us, I think, are in agreement that there is not a zero-sum relationship between human rights and denuclearization. To this Commission's credit, there seems to be an understanding of this fact. Congress has a record of consistency on the human rights issues and has been bipartisan in its statements and in its legislation. As Greg said, the threat posed by the North Korean regime stems not just from the nuclear weapons and the missile threats, but from a government in possession of such weapons which is capable of a level of abuse of its own citizens unprecedented in modern human history. This administration and future ones would be well served to consider the following principles and tasks as it thinks about how to knit together a denuclearization and a human rights agenda. The first of these, and these are part of work that we have done at the Bush Institute on trying to bring these two issues together. The first is, as Greg noted, to demand human rights improvements as part of a denuclearization. A North Korea that is improving its human rights record would signal more of a commitment to reform and joining the community of nations than almost any other measure it could take. This could even possibly make more credible any actions they took on the denuclearization front with outside verification. Second, we must view human rights sanctions as part of stemming proliferation. Revenues from North Korean human rights abuses, including the export of slave labor, as well as from trading companies engaged in such abuses, are suspected to be used to fund nuclear proliferation activities. Third, we should declare that true peace cannot come without improving the welfare of all Koreans on the peninsula. An integral part of tension reduction and reconciliation requires greater transparency and cooperation in improving the human condition in the North. Fourth, we need to prioritize information flows. The administration should increase the volume of information to the North Korean people, as access to outside information is a basic human right and indeed is greatly demanded by North Koreans that have become more conversant with the outside world through the proliferation of markets in the country. Fifth, we need to create opportunities for the next generation. Roberta, Greg, have all been involved with efforts, in my case with the Bush Institute, to embrace the chance to empower North Korean refugees in the United States, many of whom send money and information back to their families at home. These people could be future leaders of the country. And finally, sixth, we need to consider humanitarian assistance. We have to remain open to incorporating humanitarian assistance in a way that helps the North Koreans' most vulnerable citizens. As Ambassador Bob King, the previous administration's envoy for North Korean human rights, has written in a recent CSIS commentary, one important benefit of humanitarian assistance is that North Koreans, from senior government officials to individual recipients in remote villages, have contact with U.S. citizens and with citizens of other countries. This helps increase the flow of information about the outside world in one of the most isolated places in the world. The task is to find the sweet spot between denuclearization peace and the promotion of human rights in the country. These are not as diametrically opposed objectives as we have been led to believe through the past 20 years of negotiations. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ms. Cohen?
Thank you. My appreciation to the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission and its co-chairs for holding this hearing to highlight the importance of incorporating human rights and humanitarian concerns into negotiations with North Korea. The Singapore Joint Statement of 2018 omitted any mention of human rights or humanitarian objectives, even though these issues are linked to peace and prosperity and will necessarily come up if there is normalization of relations between the United States and North Korea. A comprehensive policy is needed to encompass nuclear security, a political settlement, economic aid and investment, and the promotion of human rights and humanitarian objectives. Human rights would be put forward not as a weapon or a periodic denunciation, but as a set of important issues on which improved relations would depend and which need to be negotiated. The priority issues for U.S. policy would begin first with those specific to America's own interests, most notably the protection of Americans who visit North Korea. The United States must negotiate a halt to what has become routine political detentions of its citizens, 15 over the past 9 years, and make clear that if Americans are to travel, teach, and do business in North Korea, as well as conduct humanitarian operations and agricultural programs, North Korea must assure their protection in accordance with international norms and practices. Without such basic understandings, normalization cannot progress. A second issue should be the hundreds, possibly thousands of Korean Americans who may wish to visit their relatives in the North from whom they've been separated since the Korean War. A negotiation is needed to avoid some of the pitfalls of inter-Korean reunions. For example, the meetings with relatives should be held not only in North Korea under surveillance. In addition, and most importantly, relatives must be able to remain in contact after the reunions. A third issue should be compliance with international standards for humanitarian aid. Before the U.S. resumes funding for large-scale shipments, it must seek firmer assurances than in the past, both from the authorities and from the UN agencies and NGOs that deliver the aid, that the aid reaches those for whom it is intended and not diverted to the military, elite, or other favored groups. The aid workers need full access for monitoring, data collection, and contact with beneficiaries as set forth in U.S. law, and also must be allowed to reach the most vulnerable people, a basic humanitarian principle. The most vulnerable include the tens of thousands of men, women, and children in the political prisons and re-education through labor camps. They constitute the most acute cases of hunger and disease in the country. They should not be ignored when humanitarian aid goes forward. The North Korea Human Rights Act makes better conditions in the camps a priority concern. So does the North Korea Sanctions and Policy Enhancement Act, which also makes the release of all political prisoners a condition for the lifting of sanctions. Fourth, the protection of North Korean refugees should be part of negotiations with North Korea, China, and other states. While the North Korean refugee numbers are small compared with other refugee movements, those who manage to escape across the border are routinely arrested and pushed back by China, and then brutally punished by North Korea, acts deemed by the UN Commission of Inquiry to constitute crimes against humanity. A multilateral approach needs to be initiated, and one in which the UN Secretary General, who was formerly the High Commissioner for Refugees, should play a strong role. Finally, the U.S. should do all it can to expand the availability of information to the North Korean people through radio broadcasts and other messaging. It can help erode the information blockade to which they are subject, offer a fuller range of views, and provide useful ways to address the problems they face in business, private markets, agriculture, and other fields. Further, the U.S. should encourage efforts to disseminate human rights information in the country in ways that could resonate with workers, with women's groups, and others. After all, the freer movement of people and ideas should accompany normalization. To oversee the human rights and humanitarian parts of a comprehensive policy, Congress must insist on the appointment of a special envoy for human rights in North Korea, as provided for in the law. In addition to other responsibilities, the envoy can help translate into concrete actions the statements made by the President and other senior officials. For example, President Trump raised the release of imprisoned Christians at the summit. A strategy is needed. Human rights negotiations with North Korea may or may not succeed, but there may be political and economic benefits North Korea seeks in exchange for concessions. The human rights agenda is not one for North Korea to decide alone. Indeed, it might be helpful for congressional staff to bring together all the disparate elements of U.S. law pertinent to human rights in North Korea, together with executive branch orders, Treasury regulations, and other provisions, so that they're summarized and bulleted, easy to access, and can make North Korean officials better aware of the breadth of human rights concerns on Capitol Hill and the human rights progress required for the lifting of sanctions. Above all, it must be emphasized to North Korea, brought across, that human rights are not a cloak that the U.S. can readily remove in deference to North Korea's sensitivities. Human rights are our history and heritage and what we stand for. Human rights are who we are and our strength as a nation. It must be addressed in order for relations between North Korea and the United States to develop. Thank you.
It's up to you. Well, I'm going to yield to my colleague, who we're happy he's here, Mr. Holcomb, for his opening statement.
Thank you to my good friend and co-chair McGovern for covering for me. Sorry, busy day, markup and floor speech, so I apologize that I'm running late, but thank you so much, and thank you for starting things and for the great teamwork that we continue to enjoy. I do, again, want to thank you all, and especially want to thank our expert witnesses for taking time out of their busy schedules to come and testify today. I'm grateful for the important work that you're doing on this topic. North Korea's regime's unchanging pattern of systemic, egregious human rights violations is well documented over the course of many years. The people of North Korea continue to suffer under the government's policies of arbitrary detention, torture, extrajudicial killings, human trafficking, and forced abortion. Freedom of speech, religion, the press, and assembly do not exist in North Korea. There is no independent judiciary, and the citizens do not have the right to choose their own government. The United States Commission on International Religious Freedom, or USCIRF's 2018 annual report states that the North Korean government treats all religions as a threat and often arrests, tortures, imprisons, and even executes those who practice their faith. All religious activity in the country is banned except for a small number of houses of worship that are fully controlled by the state. Multiple reports describe a system of prison camps in North Korea, often portrayed as concentration camps, which currently detain roughly 100,000 political prisoners. Reports from survivors and escapees cite that starvation, disease, executions, and torture of prisoners is common to everyday life in these camps. According to the United Nations Commission of Inquiry, close to 400,000 prisoners perished while in captivity between 1982 and 2013. It's difficult to comprehend the magnitude of these numbers. I and my staff have met with several refugees and survivors who were able to escape the horrors of North Korea, flee to the United States, and to be able to share their stories with us. I've found their endurance in suffering and their unquenchable desire for basic universal freedoms to be both inspiring and heartbreaking. We met with one woman who, as a Christian, told us about how she often worshiped in potato cellars and prayed secretly under blankets to avoid detection. She escaped from North Korea 3 times. She was twice sold into sexual slavery and twice repatriated by China back to North Korea, where she was brutally tortured. Today, she's working tirelessly to advocate on behalf of those who are still suffering in similar situations. Along with North Korea's oppression of their own people, its threats of armed conflict against the United States, and the development of its nuclear program are all also well documented. As before, both the security and human rights situations in North Korea become increasingly urgent, policymakers debate whether raising human rights in a security dialogue will threaten progress on reducing a direct military threat to the United States, or if the two tracks can be complementary. I wanted to make sure that we had today's hearing to discuss how human rights can be strategic for obtaining a credible, verifiable denuclearization deal with North Korea. Incorporating human rights considerations into denuclearization talks is critically important, both as a measure of good faith from a regime that has proven impossible to trust, and because a country that perpetrates crimes against humanity will only continue to breed global instability. The security of the United States is our priority, but we can perhaps achieve this best by considering the interests and aspirations of the people of North Korea, and not only those of the regime. So again, I want to thank the witness here today. I want to thank my co-chairman, and already I've learned so much and want to know again how we can encourage proper next steps for our government and ultimately the hope of real change in North Korea. So with that, I will yield to my co-chairman for any questions you might have.
Well, thank you very much, and again, I appreciate all the testimonies here today. I have just a few questions, and I mean, first is, how would you go about linking human rights with denuclearization if you were designing the next set of negotiations? You know, where would you start, and why would North Korea accept?
So it's a great question. So let me start by saying where I think they fit in past negotiations, at least in theory. In theory, a discussion of human rights would have been in one of the bilateral working groups that were a part of the six-party talks. So I was involved in the six-party talks the last time. And out of that six-party agreement, there was a denuclearization working group, there's an economic and energy working group, there were a number of others, and then there was one on U.S. DPRK normalization. So I think that's where it would have fit in past negotiations. Frankly, it wasn't an issue that came up at that point. It was still, that working group was very much in its infancy, and it was largely about sanctions. That's what the North Koreans were interested in. In current and future negotiations, I think the situation has changed a little bit. For one, we don't have bilateral working groups nested in some broader multilateral organization. So this would have to be something that would be directly in a U.S. DPRK, whether it's at the presidential level or it's at a working level. That's where I think one of the places, that's where it would have to take place. The other thing that's different is, unlike in the past, there are now sanctions that this body as well as executive orders have put on North Korea for human rights violations, as Roberta said. And so, in that sense, there is, you asked, like, why would the North Koreans be interested in this? In a sense now, there is a very clean line of negotiation. If they take steps in terms of addressing the human rights situations, then sanctions will be lifted. My personal view is the same thing on denuclearization. We should not be talking about denuclearization in exchange for a peace treaty or these other things. It should be for a lifting of sanctions, because that's the way these two issues have evolved. Having said that, I think it's also important, as Greg noted, as well, and as you noted in your opening statement as well, Chairman, that it must be impressed upon the North Koreans that steps in positive directions on human rights would have a broader meaning and a broader impact on the way the outside world viewed the regime. I mean, again, that to me would be a much more credible symbol of an interest in really reform and opening up than another decommissioning of a nuclear test site that is not verified by anybody except journalists who are sitting too far away to see anything.
Oh, other comments, Ms. Cohen?
Yes, I would say that there's often the view that, there's often the view that human rights are supposed to be raised right in the middle of the nuclear agreements, and then everything, it's often argued, and then everything is going to go awry. That's not the way I would see it at all. I think that Victor and Greg, when they spoke, Greg mentioned the Helsinki process, Victor mentioned the six-party talks. In other words, a forum or arrangements were necessary for the discussion of certain issues. Most important is, I think the United States has to make clear that this is a set of important issues that they would like to negotiate with North Korea. North Korea could well have the impression that the United States regards human rights as some sort of bully pulpit and denunciation of them as depraved and a tool that they use to maximize pressure at different times and then drop it, as Victor mentioned. They must have the idea that it's important for the United States in any relationship with them, a normalization of relations, to address some of these human rights issues. That this is a part of the relationship that must be maintained. And I don't think that has been conveyed. Then I think you need a forum for it, arrangements to do this. And I would say that they can be parallel, they can be thereafter, but denuclearization is a process, as was pointed out earlier, I think by Congressman McGovern. So are human rights. And it needs to be given that definite discussion going into and working out agreements. When I mentioned the first issue that I thought was important, and that was the protection for Americans, you cannot have denuclearization and you cannot have travel and information and Americans going in and then have follow-ups with exchanges and other kinds of teaching and humanitarian aid without a basic protection for the Americans going in. So I think so many of the human rights issues are related to the other steps that will be taken. And North Korea would probably like normalization of relations for their own reasons, would like exchanges, would like the lifting of sanctions. And probably Kim Jong-un and his sister would like to get off the list of sanctioned individuals in the United States, which is in the law, or in the Treasury regulation. These have to be negotiated. The same thing for economic development aid, the same thing for humanitarian aid. So I think it has to be part of a lot of the subsequent, the denuclearization leads into all of these other areas. And human rights is very much a part of it, but you have to have a forum and you also have to have a special envoy or somebody that's following this very closely.
Scalzo?
Chairman, Kim Jong-un is keen on his policy, the Pyongyang policy, the policy of simultaneous development of the nuclear weapons and economic development. He seems to be indicating interest in economic development. President Trump showed him a trailer featuring a future denuclearized North Korea. Of course, denuclearization is extraordinarily important. It's an absolute precondition prior to taking any steps on North Korea's economic development. And that said, it will take much more than just denuclearization for North Korea to develop. And we must convey this message to the North Korean regime. It will be impossible for the U.S. Agency for International Development or the World Bank to be running a water and sanitation project next to a political prison camp. It will be impossible to develop North Korea without any property rights. It will be impossible to develop North Korea without observance of human rights, labor rights. It will be practically impossible for any investor to step in without assuming significant risks. In addition to human rights compliance, naturally, in order to join, for example, the World Bank, they would need to collect their national statistical data, reduce their military expenditure, learn how to work with foreign technical assistance. And these are all quite normal and logical steps that a country such as North Korea would have to take in order to achieve a certain level of economic development.
Let me just ask this last series of questions, and I unfortunately have to go to another event, another meeting. But does existing U.S. law provide a sufficient framework or sufficient guidance for strategically linking human rights and denuclearization? Number one, and then the final thing is, like, why do you think it seems difficult for one administration to learn from another? Why do we seem to start from scratch each time rather than having a unified state policy on this issue? Really, at least that's my impression. Maybe you have a different one, but I throw those out as my final questions here.
Let me try. I'll let the true experts speak to the first question. Let me try the second one. So I think so. There is. Of the two parties, there is clearly more consistency on the other side of the table. The North Koreans that are involved in negotiations today are the same ones that we dealt with 15 years ago, and they're the same ones that were dealt with the 11 years prior to that. There is a consistency there. I mean, part of it is the nature of our system. We have new administrations that come in and go out. I think the other is that we have, unfortunately, to say, this is an issue that has been very politicized in the past, whether it was a transition from Clinton to Bush, in particular, where each administration that comes in, particularly if there are a change of parties, thinks that the other administration didn't do things correctly. In my book, I show that over the past 25 years, there is actually remarkable consistency in U.S. policy in terms of the offer of statements of peaceful intent, communications that took place between letters that were sent by our president to the North Korean leader. There is actually surprising consistency. I think the reason we end up reinventing the wheel each time is that we always think we're the problem. We didn't talk to them enough. We didn't talk to them at a high enough level. But in the end, that's really not the problem, right? But I think that's why it always gets, the wheel always gets reinvented.
Thank you.
In addition to the North Korea Human Rights Act, was the North Korea Policy Sanctions and Policy Enforcement Act. And that focuses, that was the first time that human rights was actually placed together with other issues when it came to sanctions. So this was very helpful to those interested in human rights cause to actually have it linked to specific calibrated sanctions about releases of prisoners and abductions and other major human rights issues. The North Korea Human Rights Act called for the appointment of the Special Envoy on Human Rights in North Korea. I think, a lot of attention should be paid to implementing the acts. The position of Special Envoy has been empty for more than a year. So I think in Congress is looking at this, they should be looking at having a special person to look at this issue. Very often you hear that the position could be dual-hatted. I don't think that's what was intended when the North Korea Human Rights Act was put forward and adopted.
Right.
I think it was recognized that you need somebody to advocate specifically on these issues and see how to incorporate them
Any of you guys available?
in policy. I've been trying to retire for 10 years. The other point is that Greg raised the importance of economic development to North Korea and how human rights ties into that. It might be interesting for Congress to look at what is necessary in the way of human rights in order to achieve humanitarian aid, in order to achieve development aid, in order to achieve a political settlement, so that you begin and try to find realistic ways that would be necessary, but that North Korea would understand are steps they have to take. So that it's not all within a punitive framework in terms of sanctions, but in one about how you can achieve and reach a certain point where you have a normalization of relations.
Certainly it was remarkable from our viewpoint as North Korean human rights defenders. What was remarkable about the North Korea Sanctions and Policy Enforcement Act was that it did include human rights violations in the set of behaviors subjected to sanctions. Prior to that, sanctions grounded in UN Security Council resolutions had absolutely nothing to do with a human rights rationale. After that as well, arguably one issue has been included relatively recently: workers sent overseas in order to obtain hard currency. However, the rationale behind that issue is a rationale that has to do with severing the regime's sources of hard currency rather than the human rights rationale, the abysmal working conditions where these workers are dispatched. That said, there is this linkage between the sanctions regime and human rights violations. I am not sure that there is enough in U.S. legislation to establish clear linkages between human rights and denuclearization.
Thank you. Thank you very much. This has been incredibly informative for me, and I apologize I have to leave, but I really appreciate you being here. Thank you.
Thanks, Co-Chairman McGovern. Again, thank you all for being here. I have a couple questions for each of you, and then maybe a final question for all of you, if that's all right. But Mr. Scarlato, if I can first to you, and maybe you've talked a little bit about this, and if so, I apologize, but wanted just to get a little bit more specific. Observers, I think, have noted that the current UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights appears to have toned down some of the language describing North Korea's human rights situation in an effort to secure visitation privileges and increase dialogue. Do you agree with these observations first? And if so, what's your opinion of this approach?
Well, I think that Special Rapporteur Quintana has continued to stay committed to the mandate of his office. As an insider, one inside the human rights movement, I know that media have not always been fair to him. He took a lot of blame for a particular issue: the 12 North Korean waitresses who defected from China to South Korea. He made some statements along the lines that this issue needs further investigation. Perhaps it was not exactly a defection. Perhaps they were abducted by the South Koreans, by South Korean intelligence. That was clearly not the case. The previous South Korean administration stated very clearly that this was a defection. The current government of President Moon Jae-in, the Minister of Unification, has clearly stated that this was not an abduction, it was a defection. However, Special Rapporteur Quintana addresses a lot of issues at his hearings and at his press briefings. Unfortunately, representatives of the press tend to focus exclusively on this issue, and I believe it is quite upsetting to the Special Rapporteur, but it's part of life.
I know how he feels some days. But thank you. One more question. North Korea has engaged with the United Nations on improving human rights of the disabled, including ratifying the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. I wonder, do you believe that progress on issues like these can lead to more dialogue on other human rights issues or abuses? What would be the connection, I guess? And would you agree that there has been some progress there?
Well, there are organizations. We have not conducted, us as the Committee for Human Rights in North Korea, we have not conducted specific research on these particular issues, but other human rights organizations seem to agree that there has been some progress on the rights of people with disabilities. Of course, North Korea ratified the convention, but there is more to that than just ratifying. It's important to include the respective provisions in the municipal law, in the domestic law of North Korea. It is very important to have the capacity to implement those laws. It is very important to have effective implementation of those laws. Unfortunately, one problem that we face, well, that the people of North Korea face, is that they do not read their own constitution. They're not allowed to read their own legislation. I was speaking to a friend in the North Korean escapee community in South Korea who was arrested and, of course, roughed up, beaten, tortured by the Ministry of Public Security. He recalled that there was a criminal code of North Korea hanging by a chain on the wall at the police station, stamped top secret. All North Korean people have access to is the TPMI, the 10 principles of monolithic guidance, basically the 10 principles cementing the regime's grip on power, this dynastic grip on power. That said, any semblance of development on compliance with internationally accepted human rights standards is always welcome, and why not? It might provide an opportunity. The UN Special Rapporteur for the Rights of People with Disabilities, Mrs. Aguilar, visited North Korea last year. She was not overly optimistic about future prospects. She was fully aware of the circumstances of the visit, of the fact that everything is tightly controlled in North Korea, but nevertheless, it's a small step, but perhaps a small step forward.
Let's hope. Mr. Cha, if I can address a couple to you. You talked about how there is not a zero-sum relationship between discussing both human rights and denuclearization at the negotiating table. How can the U.S. go about breaking this false dichotomy? Does such criticism make North Korea less likely to offer concessions on its nuclear and missile programs?
So I think I do believe that there isn't a zero-sum relationship. That has been by default, that is what has emerged as the practice. To me, the way, and clearly legislation that requires the appointment of a special envoy has not solved that either. I mean, what it requires is a political decision and the political will of not the negotiator, but the commander-in-chief, the president, to say that these issues are going to be taken as a whole and not separately. That, I think, is, that is something that we haven't tried yet, and we do have a channel to do that now because this president has opted for very high-level communications directly with the North Korean leadership, and we are starting to get put into place underneath Secretary Pompeo a negotiating framework, a negotiating team, and a negotiating framework. So, that is something I think that would have to be agreed to within the U.S. interagency first, consensus that would be developed. I'm sure there would be support from this body for that, and then it would have to be then dictated down by the president, I think.
Mr. Cha, you shared several clear ways that human rights are directly connected to UN security concerns when it comes to North Korea. I wonder if you could discuss in more detail how North Korea uses revenue from exported slave labor and human trafficking to fund nuclear proliferation activities, and what does this practice entail, and how do you imagine that it could be successfully incorporated into negotiations to to impact that.
So I would also refer to some of the really great work that the Committee for Human Rights has done on this. But as you know well, I mean, North Korea is a country that's starved for hard currency. And they've devoted a good portion of their national resources for well over 2.5 decades towards development of these of the nuclear weapons programs and missile programs and other related WMD programs. In that sense, much of the commerce that takes place dictated by the state has enveloped within it all sorts of human rights violations, whether it's in the form of coal exports to China that include all sorts of human rights violations, and the revenues from that, we believe, go to financing at least some or part of the nuclear weapons programs. When I was in government, the other big measure that we were taking on, unfortunately, was not on human rights, but it was on illicit activities, the counterfeiting, the drug smuggling, the counterfeiting of the U.S. currency, and other things. This was all operated out of a particular office in North Korea that is not just responsible for those activities, but has been responsible for proliferation, for terrorism, for all these. So it's difficult, while, and I think Greg has done some good work on that, while we cannot point to every single definitive line of commerce and revenues related to proliferation, the bodies that do this work are all very much smushed together. That's a technical term. They're all kind of pushed together. And that makes it very difficult to not assume that there is some connection between these revenues and proliferation financing.
Do either of the two of you have any more on that?
Well, what do we know about this operation of dispatching North Korean workers overseas is that currently there are about 100,000 of them dispatched to 30 countries on several continents. We assess the total amount of hard currency earned by these workers to be around $200 million a year. Up to 90% of their revenue is confiscated by the North Korean regime, as was the case with other hard currency earning operations. Of course, the Kaesong Industrial Complex comes to mind. This was yielding about $120 million a year. How many percent of those funds go to the North Korean regime? 100%. This is hard currency. How does the regime channel its resources? First and foremost toward those areas that it regards as critical to executing its fundamental strategic objectives. The fundamental strategic objective is, of course, survival. It regards nuclear weapons, ballistic missiles, and keeping the elites happy by maintaining their access to luxury goods from the outside world as being three critical areas. That's where most of the hard currency goes.
If I can switch to you, Ms. Cohn, thank you again for your work, and thanks for not retiring yet. We need you. So I wonder, you provide several concrete human rights benchmarks that the U.S. should require of North Korea. I wonder how the Trump administration most effectively could link these benchmarks to the peace regime that was discussed by the two sides in Singapore. How can the U.S. go about this in a way that won't be flatly rejected? And what point should North Korea's human rights record be a sticking point for negotiations moving forward?
It's often asked about human rights, that's a sticking point, do we then drop it? And that's where I'd like to begin. I think the United States has to make very clear to North Korea that this is an issue that breaks down into different questions for us that are important. And I don't know that that has been conveyed to North Korea yet. We're not going to drop the issue. It's a process. It's something that matters and that connects to all follow-up to denuclearization. And even denuclearization requires access and requires verification and requires information exchange, so that human rights basically is part of every part of what will be agreed with North Korea. But it's not an issue that can be dropped. At the same time, it should be presented not as a tool that we use on occasion and then walk away from, or as a denunciation, constant denunciation and public humiliation. I think that it ought to get down to a negotiating phase, very carefully worked out, of what we're looking for and how that can be achieved here. So I think that this is one way where we don't come in and say, oh, human rights, that has to be human rights, and you have to open your prisons right now, and that will be flatly rejected. So I think it has to be a business-like approach, and I think the important thing is that the administration have its priorities of what are the issues important to it to raise, and what do they hope to achieve on each issue.
Ms. Coney, you identified 5 different key human rights issues that the United States should address in negotiations. And maybe you've kind of hinted towards this, but more directly, is there one issue that you believe is the most important to address in talks with North Korea? And what steps should we as Congress or the administration take to reach a deal with North Korea that solves that specific issue?
I don't think I'm going to choose. I did indicate there were some that were part of American interests, very closely tied with them, so obviously that would have some priority. But what I would say is most important from this is to establish a forum or some kind of political discussion arrangement where it is known that human rights and humanitarian issues are going to be discussed between North Korea and the United States and worked out. This is not a public forum. This is not even a dialogue about human rights. It's really, you need some kind of conclusion to all the knowledge and information that we have about human rights. It needs to be boiled down now into what can we achieve. And North Korea has to know that in order to move forward with the United States, this will be something they will have to participate in. And I would say that North Korea, at different times when they have wanted something, they've known how to do it. They knew they wouldn't get a summit with President Trump unless they released the 3 Americans. I mean, there are times, or with the Japanese as well, at a different point in time, they acknowledged abductions. They allowed some of the abductees to return to Japan. They got a lot of financial aid with that. But they have, and at the UN, where you mentioned, they do take some steps because there's a lot of pressure there. And there's resolutions, and they have taken some steps to cooperate. They're small. We don't consider them very significant, but they're there. And so I think that that would be the most important thing to get a real negotiation going.
To what Roberta said. The first is that I would echo something she said in her testimony, which is North Koreans are not going to like to hear a discussion about human rights, but if this process rolls forward and there is actually talk about normalization, as Roberta said, they will have to understand that human rights is part of who we are. And if you want a relationship with this country, then this is part of that relationship. The second thing I would say is much more down in the weeds, and that is, should this process roll forward, you asked, Congressman, which issue? But should this process roll forward, it may present itself the issues that we have to deal with first. So, for example, it's difficult to have any discussion with them on human rights right now because our main channel of dialogue is about denuclearization. But if at some point in the future, and I'm not advocating that we should, but at some point in the future, if we do open liaison offices in the 2 countries, then naturally one of the first issues is going to be protection of Americans that are in North Korea. So my point is that there could be a process that rolls forward that would present opportunities in which we could start talking about some of these things, initially for very practical reasons.
Could I add, please, that
Sure.
the non-appointment to date of the special envoy is really a signal that human rights does not have the priority. And if that's the case, it's going to undermine, in North Korea's view, the issues that are raised. The appointment of that envoy with the full name and somebody specifically on that issue, who also can show up at different meetings, even to sit on the side, will be a signal. But you're getting a reverse signal now, and I think it's not going to work in U.S. favor.
I wonder if you could talk just briefly, from your perspective, is there a reason why it hasn't happened yet, and what we as members of Congress can do to say this is important, this is something that really needs to happen and needs to happen soon?
I would not advise you how to make that known to the State Department executive branch, but I think you know better than I do what your best lines of communication are there. But it is important to point out that the appointment, the non-appointment, is acting like a green light, and North Korea will be less inclined to take seriously any human rights issues that are raised. And there are some that the Trump administration has said are very important to it. They just held a ministerial sort of conference on religious freedom. And President Trump says he raised persecution of Christians at the summit. So that issue will be undermined by the fact that there is nobody to be really trying to carry it out or promote it within the building. They should be working with the advisor, former Senator Brownback, on religious freedom. And so there, the Trump administration indicated a strong interest. And if that is so, then here would be a way to signal that this is really important to us.
I agree. Thank you. One last question, if any of you have any thoughts on this. I wonder if you could just talk briefly how you evaluate the efficacy of the Commission of Inquiry in exposing North Korean abuses. Does the crimes against humanity determination strengthen international resolve to confront the regime, and how should this influence U.S. strategy in negotiations?
There is no doubt that the February 2014 report of the UN Commission of Inquiry was a seminal moment. This is a commission of inquiry that found that many of the egregious human rights violations being perpetrated, in particular at North Korea's unlawful detention facilities, amounted to crimes against humanity. The UN Commission of Inquiry and the report of the UN Commission of Inquiry continues to be a great source of legitimacy for this movement, the North Korean human rights movement. And as Roberta was mentioning earlier, as our co-chair of the board, Roberta was mentioning earlier, indeed, the North Korean government does react to human rights initiatives. Prior to the UNCOI report, they knew that this issue would come and go away, disappear off the radar screen. However, post-UNCOI, they have come to the understanding that this issue is here to stay. Now, of course, it will take commitment on our side as well to ensure that we remain committed to this issue. We had a coalition of the like-minded supporting post-UNCOI initiatives. For example, UN General Assembly resolutions passed in third committee addressing North Korean human rights. There was a paragraph on crimes against humanity included in each and every one of these resolutions. Since 2014, every year, the North Korean human rights issue has been placed on the agenda of the UN Security Council. Behind these efforts, we had this informal coalition, the United States, the European Union, Japan, the Republic of Korea, and others. If even one member of this coalition withdraws and no longer participates as an active member of this coalition, we might be in danger of losing momentum. It will be very important to continue to talk to our staunch friends, allies, and partners in South Korea and remind them that this is an important issue. This is an issue that we have addressed together for quite a few years now.
I think Greg explained it very well. The only thing I would add is that one of the things that the COI really did was demonstrate to North Korea that this is not just an issue that the United States believes in, that the entire world, by the vote, the entire world does. Having said that, it requires the United States to lead on it, because all the other parties, frankly, right now who are involved in this negotiation are not putting this at the top of their list. Like, I don't see the Chinese putting this at the top of the list, and unfortunately, I don't see the South Koreans putting this at the top of the list. So, you know, on the one hand, I think you're absolutely right. It draws attention to how this is a broader issue, and as broad as it is, still the United States has to lead on it.
It's very important that the United States, at the General Assembly, maintain and affirm their very strong support of the annual resolution. And the annual resolution also involves Security Council consideration of North Korea. And North Korea human rights situation is on the Security Council agenda. With a view to accountability. The U.S. will have to work out its own policy toward accountability, but it must make sure that the item is again on the Security Council agenda. It takes a vote each time, and that there's leadership, as Victor and Greg have said. The Security Council is an important part of this. And then in the General Assembly, it's amazing how things can just disintegrate unless there is some strong heft behind it. And if the U.S. is in the middle of negotiations with North Korea, the one thing North Korea would like very much would be to weaken the General Assembly resolution and to remove from it paragraphs on crimes against humanity and accountability. They in the past have tried to do that. It would be a real, I would say it would be a very low point if the U.S. were to basically agree with that or just ignore the role they've played in the past and allowed a weaker resolution to come forward. So I think here Congress can play a very strong role in making sure that the U.S. is behind the strong resolution.
Great. Thank you. I appreciate each and every one of you for your work, for your testimony, for helping us understand this. I would hope you see that there is strong interest here in Congress, bipartisan interest of certainly for every person in North Korea, and certainly want to make sure that our country is safe and secure, but we also want to do everything that we can to be proactive and encouraging and pushing and putting pressure where appropriate to get other countries to change what they've been doing to the detriment of their own people. And so if there are suggestions you have for us, I've taken many notes from today, and one thing, reality of this place is it's busy. There's a lot of things going on, but that's part of our role here on the commission, is just to make sure that we're getting information from you and getting it to our colleagues. And so that's my co-chairman and my commitment to you, is we will do that. And if we can be further help or suggestions you have of things that we can do in Congress to continue to encourage the administration or other efforts to be focused on this in appropriate ways, please let us know. But again, thank you for your work. Thank you for your time. And with that, we will adjourn the commission. Thank you.